My guest today is Dr. John Fea. He's a distinguished professor of American history at Messiah University, an award-winning author of several books. He also has a blog and podcast, both titled The Way of Improvement Leads Home. And he's also my former professor. I took his American history course a few years ago. I believe it was Colonization to 1865. And I always really enjoyed his lectures very much. So I am excited to have the opportunity to speak with him today. Dr. Fea, thank you so much for being here. How are you, sir?
Thanks for having me, Dylan. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Doing well.
Excellent. So there are so many questions I want to ask you, all of which pertain to a variety of different topics. So I anticipate that there will be some frequent pivoting so we can cover as much as we can. But I wanted to start by sort of broadly relating American history to the current state of America and also get your overall assessment of that. But before we do that, let's hear a little bit of what your background is and what particular areas of being a historian interest you the most.
Yeah, sure. I'm an American historian, first of all, and within American history, I did my doctoral training in early American history. You mentioned that class, Colonization to 1865. So I focus largely as a scholar in those areas. But I also focus on American religious history too, from kind of all the colonies all the way up to the present. So my recent book I wrote a book about Donald Trump and evangelical Christians, for example. Some of my other books have been on the American founding, the 18th century, Enlightenment, and those kinds of things. So the older I get, the less specialized I become. So I tend to kind of move around into things that just kind of interest me, but all within the realm of American history.
Perfect. So speaking of history and relating it to the present, because I remember when I took your seminar, you talked about, why study history, and you talked about how the past is extremely applicable to the present as well as the future. And we've been hearing a lot of references to these historical terms in the past year. To name a few, we're at a defining moment in our history, or about us being on the brink of civil war, or the government's becoming more tyrannical. We're currently part of the third industrial revolution with automation rapidly taking over, et cetera. So are there any parallels that you can draw between what we're seeing take place today in America versus a specific point in American history?
Yeah, sure. That's a big question. I think whenever you think about the role of history, and you mentioned kind of why study history, you're always looking for, historians look at continuity between the past and the present. They also look at change over time, right? So, sometimes we find people in the past that look very similar to us, or movements in the past that look very similar to contemporary movements. I don't think any movements are exactly the same. Oftentimes we hear the phrase history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of movements, especially political movements, that sort of are going on today that we've seen before. On the other hand, there's a lot of things in the present that just look completely different or are new, right, that we haven't seen before. So I think if we were think about American politics, which I tend to focus a lot of my writing on, I think there's a lot of similarities between the kind of populism that we see, especially the populism that Donald Trump's presidency tapped into, right? When I say populism, I mean tapping into sort of ordinary people who felt that they did not have a voice, or are disgruntled, or believe that the society is being controlled by powerful sort of elites, they would say, that don't give them their voice. In some ways, populism is very much connected to sort of enhancing democracy, giving more and more people a voice. So I think someone like Donald Trump tapped into this kind of populist stream within American history. We see it in the early 19th century with the rise of democracy and Andrew Jackson's presidency. Oftentimes Trump gets compared to Andrew Jackson, or the common farmers who were part of a specific movement in the late 19th century known as the populist movement. But I think you see a lot of this. I think democracy and populism can be a double-edged sword in American history. oftentimes populism is a movement that empowers people, right? It
Hmm.
empowers ordinary people to be involved and have their voices heard. On the other hand, populism can often be associated with a kind of anti intellectualism, anti science, anti experts, right? That maybe we also see a little bit in our culture, especially those who don't trust, say, science on the COVID, or don't trust the vaccines, or don't believe that. The government is controlled, or believe that the government is controlled by elites who are not listening to them. So I think we need to see that we always need to think about, as we're thinking about the present, a historian is always going to ask, well, have we been here before, right?
Hmm.
Or is this something new? And I think what we're seeing now is something that's we've been here before, but I also think there's a lot of things that are unique to our current moment. So I think it's important to point both of those things out.
So I wanted to ask you about a debate that's going on that sort of encapsulates all of that. There are these two competing initiatives right now. There's the 1776 Commission before it was recently terminated, and the 1619 Project, both of which argue different forms of American history, essentially. And I'll try to be as fair as I can when characterizing both of them. And I'd love to get your reaction to this. So, the 1776 Commission's premise is that, we should be proud of our history and preserve what has made the United States special and great, among other things, of course. And the 1619 Project is named after the year the slaves were brought over, thus making that the true founding of America instead of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And it's meant to shed light on the not so flattering aspects of American history and basically argues that our principles weren't made with everyone in mind and that oppression played a large role in our founding, and it remains rooted in all of our institutions. Now, the 1776 Commission was highly criticized for its lack of historical backing, and the 1619 Project is being criticized by the opposition for, teaching children that America is, inherently evil, and we should feel ashamed to have such history, and our, country's scarred because of it, and there's no way to overcome it. So, what are your thoughts on these two different versions of
Yeah.
history that are being portrayed, and do you think that there is validity to either of them?
Yeah, great question. And this is again a huge debate that historians wrestle with. And some prominent historians have fallen on both sides, especially the debate over the 1619 project. Historians have been really well respected. Historians have been kind of split over just how much how much we should take that project seriously. I do say that I will say that the 1619 project and the 1776 project are probably more about contemporary politics than they are about history. And what I mean by that is we're always in search of some kind of what we call in the historical field a usable past. A past that we can take, we can go into the past, pull things out that we want or can use so that we can advance our particular political agendas or cultural agendas or whatever they might be in the present. And I think the 1619 project and the 1776 project tend to do this. They're not particularly interested in the complexities and the nuances of the past. They are what we call kind of, in some ways, reductionist, right? Everything can be reduced to either American greatness, the 1776 project, or slavery and racism in the 1619 project. Now, let's take the 1776. Let's take 1619 since that was the first one. I think there's a lot of good that can come out of the 1619 project. The 1619 project at least calls us to a conversation about race. I mean, most people did not know that slaves came over in 1619. There's a lot of really interesting things about race that this project has triggered and has forced us to have conversations that are uncomfortable and so forth. I also think the 1619 project has some pretty bold claims that can, I think, be easily debunked, particularly about the year 1776. Was the American founding all about racism and white supremacy? In other words, did the revolution happen to preserve white supremacy? And I would probably be on the side to say that's pushing this argument a little bit too far. so again, I've talked about this and written about this in other places, but I think the 1619 project does have some problems. But a lot of this goes into what the point of studying history really is, or especially a history classroom. I think the real debate is whether, what school children should be learning about our country. And, you have the 1776 Commission, which is all patriotic history. It ignores and kind of almost whitewashes any kind of negative aspects of American history. I think it's very poorly done. There were no American historians on the committee. They were all political scientists and political pundits who were on the committee. But this whole debate kind of is somewhat insulting to your average history teacher in a K through 12 school, because the point of a history classroom is to get students to think historically. So you
Right.
give them the 1619 project, you give them the 1776 project, you give them primary documents and sources that are actually original sources, and you let them construct, you let them read and think about these kinds of things, and to see the flaws and the positive things of both projects. So I think, again, these projects are much more about contemporary politics than necessarily how to do history or the role that history should play in a democratic society.
So the motive, and you sort of alluded to this, the motive for declaring independence from Great Britain was primarily because of, taxation without representation, or the Stamp Act, and just freedom to form a destiny that was independent from Great Britain. So could slavery, to what extent do you think slavery should be considered influential in the development of the American Revolution? Or are those other reasons more significant, because the Emancipation Proclamation and outlawing slavery came, 100 years later in the 1860s, correct? So do you think that it played any role in the American Revolution?
Well, I think the 1619 project, and they since have stepped back on this. They realized, some historians, particularly historians of African American history and the American Revolution, called them out on this, and they have taken a step back. The 1619 project argues that the whole purpose of breaking away from England in 1776 was so that, or defending, the ideas of revolution, where the purpose was to defend white men defending their power over black men, slaves, black men and women. This is true in the sense that many of the founding fathers owned slavery. They were deeply threatened by the idea that liberty and freedom be applied to their slaves. But to suggest that the primary reason why they wrote things like all men are created, or all men are created equal, and they were trying to create a revolution, is so that to prevent slaves from participating in that. I don't think that was their particular conscience per se, what they were really trying to do. But certainly slavery is important. Slavery at the founding is a it's a contradiction of the American ideals. And there are historians who have suggested that even though the American Revolution did not end slavery, especially in the South, it did set in motion sort of certain ideas about liberty and freedom that would take a long time, to be applied, but that would eventually be applied to slaves and women and so forth. So this is a debate among historians, right? Is 1776, like, did the revolution, was it really a revolution in social life? Well, not really. The slaves weren't set free. Women weren't given the right to vote. Men needed to still own land to vote in most new states, right? It wasn't necessarily a very democratic revolution, but the American story became more democratic as we moved through time. Now, what the American Revolution certainly did not deal with in any way, shape, or form was the question of racism and white supremacy. I do think that despite the fact that blacks were eventually given the right to vote after the Civil War, that doesn't solve the fact that they were viewed by white people as racially inferior. So, this is a problem that even the 1960 civil rights movement has not dealt with, as we saw this summer in the streets of major American cities during the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests. So I think the 1619 Project is right to call attention to the problems of race in American society. It's as old as the Republic. But to suggest that the founding fathers gathered in Philadelphia for the First and Second Continental Congresses were there to preserve their white supremacy as slaveholders is a very difficult argument to make.
One of the many responses or social reactions to the 1619 Project have been the removal of historical figures from public areas, and I wanted to ask you about that, such as Abraham Lincoln's name being removed from a high school, a speech at Mount Rushmore being characterized as glorifying racist slaveholders. And I think a lot of people can agree that there are historical figures and symbols that we shouldn't necessarily consider flawless. But do you think that certain figures, despite their flaws, should still be admired or recognized for the work that they did to build the United States?
Sure, great question. My take on this again is a little more complex and nuanced than sort of the right and the left in American politics. I definitely think it's probably time to deal with statues of Confederate leaders who, number one, committed treason against their country during the Civil War in order to uphold the preservation of slavery. I mean, the Civil War, most historians, almost all historians worth their salt, agree was a war over slavery, not states' rights or something else. So I think, Robert E. Lee and, Braxton Bragg, who, Fort Bragg, there was this big debate over whether they should rename that fort. Um, you know, Nathan Bedford Forrest, some of these Confederate statues that are deeply offensive to African Americans, probably need to go. I think the real debate here is about those men and women who, mostly men, who owned slaves, but yet were involved or are known in American history for something other than slavery. So let's
Mm-hmm.
take, for example, George Washington, for example, a slaveholder, someone who let his slaves go free after he died, which, if you're really interested in freeing your slaves, why did you wait till after you died to do it? We could
Right.
say that. But George Washington is also known for being a general in the Continental Army, for being our first president, for a host of other things. Head of the Constitutional Convention, a host of other things. The same thing is true with Abraham Lincoln, who was not a slaveholder, who actually emancipated the slaves, but just does have a kind of darker history on the matters of race. In the famous Lincoln Douglas debates, he said, the white race is superior. At least I wouldn't allow my daughter, which he didn't have a daughter, but to marry an African American or black person. He was a product of his time in that sense. That doesn't get him off the hook, I think, but so I think the debate needs to be much more nuanced and complex than it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are all flawed human beings. You know, you're going to have to eventually take down every monument, right?
Right.
And there's also a sort of false. There's also a false. There's something else that's not true that's going on, or at least a false kind of relationship between monuments and history. So one of the things you often hear about those who are opposed to tearing down monuments is you're tearing down history, right? You're canceling American history. If we take down these monuments, you're disrespecting American history. Well, in some ways, that's kind of a very foolish approach. Um, these monuments were erected, as you may know, Dylan, at particular moments in time.
Mm-hmm.
The great age of monument building was in the early 20th century when, a lot of the Southern monuments, for example, were erected to celebrate Jim Crow and to enforce segregation, right? To remind blacks that, Robert E. Lee fought to preserve the white Confederacy, the lost cause, as it's often known.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to me, monuments are interesting because they tell that story, not necessarily for who they're commemorating in the past. And then there's this sense that, if you really care about American history, especially conservatives who are interested in cutting budgets for the National Endowment for the Humanities or other kinds of government initiatives to promote history, it's kind of ironic that they're yelling and screaming about canceling history when they're doing everything possible to cut funding to teach history in schools. There's a huge emphasis now on funding STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, as opposed to history. So if we really want to talk about canceling or getting rid of American history, we may want to think about that being more important than sort of what we do with monuments. But having said that, I think there are some good cases to be made that some of these monuments do need to come down. And rather than being destroyed, I think they need to be put in some kind of space or museum where, people like you and me can go in there and see, these monuments represent a time in American history when there were, when racism and segregation were the realities, and these monuments were symbols to that kind of white supremacy.
So many great points, and it's so interesting. My next few questions, I want to pivot to the Constitution because we've been hearing a lot about the constitutionality of things. And I want to start with the Second Amendment. And correct me if I'm wrong, it was originally created by the founders to prevent the rise of tyrannical government. There might have been other reasons, but that was the primary reason from what I understand. And what I'm hearing a lot now is that government overreach is some anachronistic idea and that there's no possibility of that ever occurring again. It belongs to a different time period. What do you think the purpose of the Second Amendment is, and what do you think could be considered infringements to it, and what is protected from a constitutional perspective?
Sure. I have the Second Amendment here. Let me read it really quickly because I want to illustrate a point here. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that word, a well-regulated militia. That phrase comes directly out of the 18th century context, in which the amendment was written. There were no standing armies, right? You only raised an army when you needed to fight a war. In other words, most of the defense of your communities from outside invaders, whether they be Native Americans or someone else, came from citizen armies. Every year they would have these militia days where, all the citizens of the town would come together and they would, learn how to march and shoot their guns and so forth, just in case of any attack, right? You saw this in the Revolution with like the Minutemen in Lexington and Concord, so to speak, right? So I think the Second Amendment needs to be understood historically within that framework. Today, the Second Amendment is, interpreted mostly by its defenders and conservatives as being universally applied to any kind of gun ownership. At least this is the argument of the National Rifle Association, right? The strongest defenders of the Second Amendment in the United States. It's very, very difficult to apply the historical context in which the document was written, namely the well-regulated militia, to the idea of that we can carry around automatic weapons and AK-47s today to protect ourselves. I think the Second Amendment is important. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. I don't know of any Democrat or liberal who wants to do away with the Second Amendment, right? I think it's important for self-defense, right? And I think the debate here is over just whether or not it can be modified to some way to prevent the use of these automatic weapons like AK-47s and so forth. So, getting to this larger question about rights and COVID and so forth, you're hearing a lot of these debates about, I have the right, the God-given right in the Declaration of Independence, right? We are endowed by our Creator with certain rights to free speech and to owning guns and, all the rest, right? The right to assemble, religious liberty. And But when the government tells us that we have to wear a mask, or when the government tells us that we have to have background checks in order to buy an automatic rifle and so forth, this is somehow government intruding on those rights and liberties. I think what this also reflects is a inherent misunderstanding, or at least a lack of understanding, a fuller picture of what the American Revolution and the founding was all about. Throughout much of the American founding, and the founding fathers always understood individual rights as part of a larger conversation about our duties and our responsibilities as citizens, and that is largely our duties and responsibilities to others. The founding fathers often called this virtue, the idea of sometimes sacrificing your rights, at least for the moment, for the greater good. So if you are going to, if wearing a mask is going to help one of your neighbors not get COVID, right? Then wearing a mask is part of, or is a very American thing to do, right?
Right.
Momentarily sacrificing your rights for some kind of greater good.
Hmm.
I think you see this with the Second Amendment as well, right? I mean, no one wants to take guns away from people. No one wants to end hunting in America. No one wants to prevent people from carrying a pistol to protect themselves or keeping one in their home. Um,
Right.
but you also need to consider sort of the destruction that some of these automatic weapons have done in schools and mass shootings and so forth. But I think we often miss that because we focus totally on the rights and not the virtue.
Hmm. You mentioned religious liberty as well, which is actually my next question. And what I've observed is that there seems to be a tension between protecting religious liberty and completely eliminating discrimination, particularly among the LGBTQ people. And what I've concluded, just based on what I've seen, is that you can't really have both at the same time because religion tends to be discriminatory to today's social standards. And therefore, if you wanted to achieve zero discrimination, you'd have to use some form of government interventionism to force people to violate their religious beliefs in pursuit of ending discrimination, which is technically compromising the religious liberty aspect of the Constitution. But many people see fair treatment as something more important than upholding one particular aspect of the Constitution, especially considering the times that it was written in when a lot of people weren't included in those rights. So I suppose my question is, being someone who is a Christian and an American historian, how should we approach these two competing initiatives and address that issue? Like, is it possible to reach a compromise?
I think it is. And I think what you put your finger on here, Dylan, is will become in the next decade or so, one of the most important constitutional debates that we're going to be seeing in our country. Um, so let's take the kind of Christian college, right, where I teach at Messiah
Hmm.
University, but also dozens and dozens of other Christian colleges around the country. A lot of these Christian colleges do discriminate. They do not hire people who are not Christians, right? Forget about LGBTQ for a second, right? They
Right.
naturally discriminate, right? You cannot teach at Messiah College unless you sign the Apostles' Creed, which is a very broad Christian creed. It includes Eastern Orthodox, Catholics, right? But
Hmm.
if you are a Muslim, you cannot have a full-time teaching position at Messiah College. So by nature, religion, you're right, religion discriminates. I'm not Jewish. So I cannot, unless I want to become Jewish, I can't make my son or daughter can't make their bar mitzvah, right? It's just, that's discrimination, right?
Hmm.
Um, Now, again, I'm sure some Jews would say, "Yeah, I'd be happy to go through the rituals and the rites of becoming Jewish, and then you can make your son or child can make your bar mitzvah, right?"
Hmm.
So on the LGBTQ issue, right? I mean, it's very complicated in the sense that, you know, there are millions and millions and millions of Christians in the United States that believe in traditional marriage and traditional sexual ethics. Um, Based upon deeply held religious beliefs. Now, there are a lot of people who really believe this stuff for political purposes or whatever, but I think there's a deeply held religious liberty issue there. right? Um, Now, what happens when that First Amendment, as you said, butts up against LGBTQ rights? Because if you are a pastor of a church that believes that marriage is between a man or a woman, and someone wants to apply to become a pastor in your or a minister in your church, and you say no, you can't because you're LGBTQ, you're discriminating against that person, and you are, right?
Hmm.
So this is the dilemma. I have latched on, or I think the best solution to this, which has gotten very little traction from either side of this debate, is a policy, a bill that was proposed by the National Association of Evangelicals, and has bipartisan support from moderate Democrats and more liberal Republicans, called the Fairness for All Act. And the Fairness for All Act essentially says this: the United States will recognize the civil rights of the LGBTQ community, which is something that a lot of conservatives reject. They refuse to do because LGBT rights are not covered in the Constitution, right? This gets to this originalism kind of idea that we might have time to talk about it later. Um,
Hmm.
but at the same time, there would be religious exemptions for churches and religious organizations that believe in traditional marriage to not be discriminated against for their religious positions. So you could have a country that's essentially both, but you're going to have to bring the two groups together. The extremes of the LGBTQ community are going to reject fairness for all because they'll still say Christian communities are going to discriminate against LGBTQ people with this. And the extremes on the right in the Christian community don't like it because they don't want LGBTQ people to have civil rights. So
Hmm.
so this is, I think, the fairness for all is the best solution. Unfortunately, because we're so polarized politically in our country, it's going to be very hard to get enough votes and people to embrace such a position. But that would be where I come down on this serious battle between the 14th Amendment, civil rights, and the First Amendment, religious liberty.
So, regarding constitutional originalism, which you just mentioned, we've been hearing a lot about that, especially with Amy Coney Barrett being nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court last fall. So, I'm curious, given your knowledge of American history and the purpose of the Constitution, what's your take on proponents of originalism, and I guess you could also call it textualist judges who seek to interpret the Constitution directly as it was written in the time and context that it was written? Because there's been a lot of controversy and valid points. I think we should consider the circumstances under which the document was written, because obviously morals have changed and times have changed. So, what aspects of the Constitution do you think, we should consider preserving, and are there any aspects of it that you think would need to be fairly updated?
Yeah, I mean this is the debate over the sort of Constitution as interpreted that's set in stone, kind of in the 18th century, and a sort of more living Constitution, right? And depending on the makeup of the Supreme Court, it's interpreted in different ways. I think as a historian, I can't embrace an originalist view of the Constitution simply because I believe in change over time. Certainly as a historian, I want my students to know the original intent of the founders, right? What were they trying to do? Why did they pass the Second Amendment? Well, in order to understand the Second Amendment, you have to understand, like we were talking about earlier, about what a well-regulated militia was, right? I want them to understand why, for example, the three-fifths clause is in the Constitution, right? Which essentially treats Africans as three-fifths of a person in terms of representation. I want them to know the decisions that the founders made in their moment, right? But I also, as a historian, know that times change, things change through the decades. And as a result, some of the questions that the 18th century framers of the Constitution were responding to are no longer relevant. Now, again, you can always change the Constitution with amendments, and that's what we've done 20 some odd times. But to suggest that on every issue we are supposed to be thinking about rather than thinking about the general principles of the Constitution, of equity and rights and so forth, to say that the Constitution is must always be interpreted in its strict textual way, really neglects the kind of context and change over time that's essential. So, this is a tough one to answer in just a few minutes, Dylan, because there's all kinds
Yeah.
of, cases where there are some things to say, like, for instance, with impeachment, right? What is a high crime and misdemeanor?
Hmm.
Um, there are times in which I think if you were to transport an 18th century founder to the present and see what Donald Trump did to incite the insurrection on January 6th, you could
Hmm.
probably make a pretty good case that they would say, yes, that is a high crime and misdemeanor, right?
Hmm.
Um, there's other times where, again, well-regulated militia is the best example of this I can think of right now, where that meant something very, very different in 18th century than it does today. So it's a very complicated kind of process, that it's going to vary from issue to issue.
Final question. I just want to wrap this up and talk about there are a lot of different government reform proposals being made that we're hearing, such as abolishing the Electoral College, packing the courts, adding statehood to D.C. and Puerto Rico for more senators, getting rid of the filibuster in Congress, like lowering the voting age to 16, not requiring an ID. There's so many proposals, and I'm curious to ask you what you think about the constitutionality. And I know that the Constitution is not like a set in stone document; it's like change over time. But what's your reaction to those are, and how much of it you think is politically motivated, so that those endorsing the ideas could have advantages in future elections? Because I mean, I hate to be cynical like this, but a lot of people, for example, are recommending lowering the voting age to 16 because young people predominantly vote a certain way, for example, and you could go on, or, the senators that will be added with those states could have a certain party affiliation. So that would give advantage when trying to pass legislation in Congress. And also just more broadly, I think the Electoral College is one of the most interesting debates. And obviously we don't have to talk about all of this, or you could speak generally, but the difference between a direct democracy and a representative democracy, and the debate around getting rid of the electoral colleges or keeping it. And I think there, in like when we spoke earlier, you said, it's kind of like a difficult issue because there are aspects of the electoral college that might be necessary, and there's others that might not be. And, you might not be able to make a definitive answer on that. So so I'm just curious. I know that was a lot, but if you could speak generally or anything specifically, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those.
I think, Dylan, whenever there's any debates over the meaning of the Constitution, political posturing and political debate and political motivations are always present. They've always been in American history. One of the first major debates over the United States Constitution, you may even remember it from my class, was the debate over the national bank, right?
Hmm.
Can there be a national bank? Well, Alexander Hamilton, who favored the national bank, said the Constitution doesn't say we can have one, right? And we have to regulate the economy. So of course there should be a national bank. He wanted to advance his vision for America, a vision of wealthy uh, investors investing in a national bank so they would give loans to manufacturers to create a more manufacturing kind of society, while Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed the national bank. They tried to make a constitutional argument. Right? National bank's not in the Constitution. You can't create this. But then they, their political motivation was they wanted to defend ordinary people, the farmers, right, who they believed were not getting their piece of the American pie if America goes kind of more manufacturing nation. And you could think of multiple examples of this through American history. So I
Hmm.
think what you're seeing with all those examples that you just mentioned, abolishing the Electoral College, bringing Puerto Rico into the Union, lowering the voting age, and so forth, these are all politically driven by Democrats who want to expand voting because essentially you're right. The levers of progress or the levers of democratic progress in the United States seem to be right now on the side of the Democrats. Large, African American communities make it easier for them to vote, make it easier for the poor to vote, and of course, all of these people tend to vote Democrat. So, you can make a constitutional argument that's a legitimate constitutional argument about doing all of these things, but let's not kid ourselves that they are motivated by political purposes. I think you also see this on the right. I think I was just writing about this morning actually on my blog. You see now all of these attempts in states to try to limit people from voting. You mentioned not having an ID. Well, now they're pushing we need an ID, or if you haven't voted in the last 2 elections, you'll be taken off the rolls, or all of these attempts to kind of suppress the vote, and they're mostly by Republicans who worry that the tide is turning away from them, and they want to make sure that, not too many people can get to the polls. There was even an Arizona state senator who said yesterday that, we don't want everybody to vote. He just came out and said it, right? So I think someone who says like, we don't want the masses or the multitudes or the people, the common person to vote, they actually, I think, sadly, have some American history on their side. A lot of the early founding fathers distrusted people from voting too. But there was also a stream within the founding that said we need to expand, always lean and err, if you will, towards the side of democracy. Always err for more people having the right to vote. So let's expand the franchise the best as we can. But these are all debates, and I'll just leave it at that. These are all debates, including the debate over the Electoral College, that are driven by politics. So, look at the people who want to abandon the Electoral College. They're all people who tend to kind of lean towards the Democratic side, the popular vote, listening to the people's voice. I mean, when you think about it, Democrats, in terms of if there was no Electoral College, Democrats would have won the 2000 election. Al Gore would have defeated George Bush. They would have won the 2016 election. Hillary would have beaten Trump. And, of course, they won the 2020 election too, even though it was a little bit closer in the Electoral College. So, the chances of a Republican candidate who doesn't have all the people behind him still being able to win looks very undemocratic to many Americans. And I think the Electoral College maybe has seen its day, right? I mean, it's very much, again, a product of the 18th century, a product of the founding fathers wanting to curb and limit the voice of the people. Let's let the Electoral College choose the vote, who wins, not the people per se. And this was an attempt in the 18th century by the founders to make sure that the people's voice, as James Madison wrote in Federalist Paper number 10, which you may remember reading in my class, to kind of filter the voice of the people, right? The people may not know what they're doing. They're faction-laden. They're self-interested. They don't have the greater good in mind. But we, educated, elite founding fathers, we do. So let's figure out some way to make sure that the people don't have too much power. And, they didn't even count the popular vote in America until 1824, right? It's just these elite men making the choices in the Electoral College. Now, today it's a little bit different. The Electoral College has to, for the most part, has to vote according to the people, but it could still, you have places like North Dakota, for example, that has incredible amount of power, in elections with, but there's hardly any people who live there.
So essentially the Electoral College is meant to sort of combat the disproportionate population, people that the densely populated cities don't necessarily speak for the people in North Dakota, for example, who might, because if it was down, because I guess proponents of the Electoral College would say that the majority or the margin of which these candidates win by the popular vote you can just look at the city and there's all your votes that won, and then it's like, who cares about what people in those, the flyover states think?
Right.
So do you think there's validity to that?
Well, think about political campaigning, right? I mean,
Right, right.
why would a Republican ever campaign in, Indiana,
Yeah,
right? Because they know they're going to win that. Or why would they
exactly.
go to New York City to campaign, right? To use your example, it doesn't make any sense,
Because they're going to
right?
lose.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, you only
Hmm.
go to the states that are sort of the so-called battleground states, and thus you kind of, most people in the other districts, they know that their vote is going to go a certain way, and there's no need to, they don't feel like they're part of the political process. And then if you count votes instead of states, right? The Electoral College counts states, right? What if you counted human beings and counted their votes, no matter what state they're living in? Then you have a look. You could have a very different election every 4 years. The big states will have much more influence, right? Where the population centers are, will have much more influence, and the population centers tend to focus much more on, tend to be more democratic oftentimes, and the rural regions tend to be more Republican. But in order to give those Republican rural regions, like places like Kansas and Nebraska and these conservative, Texas to some degree, although Texas is changing,
Hmm.
or Mississippi or Alabama, you want to allow them to have a role to play in this. So you give their state power rather than individual democracy power in those places.
It's a very interesting debate, and I think there's good arguments on both sides of that, and it's really I I love talking about this from an objective point of view and try to remove the partisanship from it. I think we need a lot more of that in this country. But
This debate will continue for a while.
well, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm hoping that others will also find it beneficial and learn a few things. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with me today. Be well.
All right, Dylan, thanks.